Thank you. So I'm Emma, and I'm going to be presenting Velvet Values. It's currently in the first year of a 3-year artistic research project, which is part of the Digital graduate program, which is part of the Berliner Chancengleichheitsprogramm. Velvet Values is housed at the Wearable Computing Department within BOL. So I'm a weaver by training, by profession, and this project is really an exploration of the embodied and intangible experiences that we develop through as a craft practitioner, specifically in relation to velvet hand weaving. So during the process of hand weaving, there are intangible experiences which are embedded in both the weaver and the cloth. Now, if anyone has taken part in any type of textile craft, if you've done any knitting or crochet, however successfully or unsuccessfully, you might know what I mean when I say that you can read your experiences in the topology of your cloth. You can see, you can trace in your material where you have held the tension too tight. You can see where you have dropped stitches and picked them up again. And quite often you can retain those memories and the lessons, the feeling of those lessons in your body. You can remember the feeling, the sensation around your fingers. You learn what it is to hold a yarn the correct way. You learn the material and that information stays within you. These, for me, I believe, are incredibly valuable lessons to be learned, and it's highly valuable information. But when the cloth becomes separated from the weaver, that knowledge dissipates. The ability to read the topography of a cloth is lost. It doesn't get passed on. So in this project, I'm using velvet weaving to find ways to identify these internalized experiences and to visualize and share them so that they can continue to travel on with the material. To begin with, I just want to give a little basic introduction of what is weaving, just in case anyone isn't very familiar with it. Weaving is a method of constructed textile production. It uses 2 sets of threads. You have the vertical warp threads. These are multiple threads which are threaded through the loom and then held under a tight tension. You then have your weft thread, which is one yarn which passes horizontally back and forth through the warp threads. And weaving is simply the motion of raising sets of these vertical warp threads while others remain lowered. And this creates a shed, a gap in between the warp threads. The weft then passes through that shed and creates an interlocking. That interlocked fabric is then a woven cloth. So now that we know what weaving is, velvet is a very particular type of weaving. In technical weave terms, it is a cut pile warp-faced cloth constructed from 2 intertwining warps. There's a big leap from just basic weaving into what that is. So I do want to give just a little bit of foundational information of what that actually means. You can retain as much or as little of this as you like. There's no quiz at the end. But essentially, velvet is a pile fabric. What a pile means is that in that open shed I talked about, created by the warp threads, the weaver inserts small rods or sticks, which you can see in the image right here. The warp threads are passed over that stick, and that creates very small loops. In velvet, the pile is cut. What does that mean? That means that as you weave, the loops of those piles are sliced open by a thin, sharp blade. Velvet's also a warp-faced cloth. Warp-faced means that as the fabric is facing you, as it's towards you, all you see is the warp. You see only these looped pile warp threads. That horizontal weft thread remains completely hidden at the back of the fabric. And finally, velvet is constructed from 2 warps. Basic fabrics will have just 1 warp, and you're simply manipulating that 1 set of threads. However, for complex materials, you can have multiple warps, and they layer or stack on top of each other in the loom. And then what you do as the weaver is you choose which layer of warp you're going to bring to the surface, which ones you're going to lower. Velvet uses 2 warps. There's one called the ground warp, which is essentially the grounding of the cloth. It will hold its entire structure together. And then you have the pile warp. That is what makes up the velvet texture that we all know. Those are the loops that then become cut. So that just gives a little bit more information as I go through with other terminology. Hopefully it's not too baffling. In context on a loom, this is an example from UdK Berlin, and this is a traditional velvet weaving loom from the Renaissance. It's still pretty much the same today. There are very few weavers who practice with velvet hand weaving, but those that do tend to use a loom that looks almost exactly like this. And you can just then get a little bit idea of the layout of the velvet loom. You can see where the weaver sits at the front. At the back of the loom is where the ground warp is wound on. And then this is what makes velvet very special. There's a whole separate section which either sits underneath the loom or behind it. And that's this wooden creel. The wooden creel holds bobbins, which I'm going to talk a lot about in a moment. It holds bobbins, which then contain all of the material for your velvet warp, for that pile warp. It passes through underneath, and then they join together to form cloth. And then I also just want to take a moment to talk about why velvet. Velvet, for me, is the perfect woven technique to explore the intangible and embodied processes, experiences that we develop as a weaver through our woven process. Velvet weaving is painfully slow. A professional velvet weaver can weave a maximum of 20 centimeters in a day. And this excessive slowness really forces you as a weaver to slow down. It expands the time you have for reflection and to nurture the types of experiences and knowledge that are at the core of this project. Additionally, the tools for velvet hand weaving can't be bought. They have to be made. So making them by hand, engaging with your tools in a completely different way, crafting your tools, deepens the connection the weaver has with the process. And finally, there's the actual production method of velvet. It is a reflective process. Usually when you're creating any form of constructive textile with weaving or knitting, you're simply working forwards. You weave one row and then the next and the next. But velvet, you work your way up and then you have to travel back down and revisit former rows. So you are literally reflecting back on your work as you're trying to also reflect on the process as you're going. So with that, I want to just now present two examples of this type of internalized and embodied knowledge that I've talked about. And I want to do that, first of all, through the bobbins. This is a bobbin. There's a few of them over on the table towards the back, which you're welcome to take a look at later. And a bobbin is a small wooden spool that the velvet silk pile warp is wound around. The bobbins are incredibly important. Each one is weighted individually, and that allows the weaver to manipulate and control them one by one to create the decorative patterns that you see that we're familiar with when we think of ornate velvet. During the course of this project, I am carving the bobbins myself and tracking the process. To make a bobbin, I've broken it down into 6 stages. First of all, there's the roughing of the wood. I'm using cherry wood for these ones. And then you carve it into its bobbin shape. It's finished with sanding and oiling. It's then measured to be checked. You wind it with the silk, and then you thread it onto the creel to then be threaded through the loom. Those are the 6 general stages of producing a bobbin. To weave a full width of velvet, you need 1,000 bobbins, and that will produce 70 centimeters wide of cloth. So that means that I'm replicating these steps 1,000 times. Please don't ask me how far I've gotten. And here you can see the very first 6 bobbins that were produced. Now, it's pretty clear from looking at these that some work, some don't, some are whole, some are broken, one is decapitated. There's some pretty obvious lessons in these, but it's not the obvious lessons that I'm interested in with them. It's the small marks that I'm able to read in the bobbins and the memories and the lessons that come with that. Each bobbin has a particular physical mark, which is then associated with a muscle memory or emotion. And then within that ties to a specific knowledge, a piece of knowledge that's been gained or a lesson that's been learned. So in the first one, it's a little hard to see on the screen, but just in here, there are irregular wave marks. And these The first 4 bobbins, by the way, are on the table. So if you want to get a better idea of the particular marks I'm talking about, you'll be able to see them. So there are irregular wave marks. These wave marks are they're created and felt through micro vibrations in the wrist as you're working on the lathe. What that actually is a sign of is it's a sign to change the chisel that I'm using. It's a sign to be working with a slightly different shape tool. On the second one, there's this chipped rim. And when that happens, that's a sign of my forearm jerking up and then traveling back down really quickly. What that actually indicates, what that's a sign of, is a need to press more firmly down with a tool instead of towards the bobbin. So you want to be pressing down instead of forwards. With the third one, this one is just pure confidence right here. So this one, you can see there's a smoothness to it. There's a flow motion that you get, particularly in the right wrist, that comes with short, sharp movements, particularly when they're matched with a rhythm of breath work. When the breath work matches the movements, then you get a result like this. The fourth bobbin is an instant shattering of my confidence. And here you can see just this snapped end, and it still hurts me to look at it. You can still feel, this abrupt shattering of confidence. You can feel the way in which these things fly off at you. And quite frankly, more than anything, it's a reminder to always stay focused and not get too cocky. The fifth one I find incredibly interesting because this is an example of grain tear out, and this one has taken me the longest to come to grips with. Grain tear out is something that happens when the fibers of the wood are pulled out too roughly. And it's been very difficult to understand what's happening in my body when I'm doing it. And I'm finally getting there. And it appears to be linked to having a particular type of tension in my left shoulder and then having the lower back twisted in a very particular position. So what I'm working on doing is adjusting my stance and reducing the pressure with my left arm to find that kind of optimal position. And finally, on the sixth bobbin, there's a scorch mark on the top. And that comes from the finishing process during the sanding. And what that is felt by is just this intense heat that you get in your left index finger from holding that sandpaper just a little bit too tightly. And what that really taught was reducing the speed on the lathe for when you're sanding. So those are some examples of the types of information. These bobbins themselves are physical forms of data. There's so much information to be mapped in there. But outside of my very lengthy explanation, how are people going to be able to read these things? So I've begun by working with the bobbin bank. The bobbin bank is a way in which I track the experience of making these bobbins. In the top central spreadsheet, what you can see is this section here is tracking the emotions that take place, emotions and focus level whilst making bobbins. It allows me to cross-reference different sections. You can cross-reference material, tool, emotion, weather, atmosphere, time, anything that is involved in them. And then you can start to draw that out to this spreadsheet here on the left. And you can start to visualize patterns. You can start to identify these visual patterns through the bobbins, and you can create different patterns based on what you're trying to understand. If you're trying to understand how the weather and your mood affect the grain tear out, you can find that information. If you want to know how patchy or smooth the texture is, you can link that to your focus level. There's all this information in there. And one of the things I really enjoy about having this particular type of visualization is that it's so similar to a traditional weave structure. Traditional weave structures are made up of grids of black and white squares. And all the way on the right, what you see here is a traditional velvet weaving notation. This right here, the illustration on the right, tells you everything you need to know to weave a particular form of velvet. And that's one of the things, again, that for me confirms that velvet is a really wonderful medium or process to be exploring these experiences through, because layers of information become transcribed and flattened out into this grid layout. Okay, so once the bobbins are produced, They all sit on a creel. Here, this is just a small mini creel I've made that's sitting on the back of my loom. This one holds 150 bobbins, which can weave a maximum of 10 centimeters width of velvet. Each one of these bobbins is wound currently with 15 meters of a thicker silk. And then the ground warp, this fine one in the middle, that sits on the back of the loom and it waits to be threaded. As the two warps are threaded together, you also develop this physical network of threads. You get this crossing over of thick and thin silk. Depending on the type of velvet that you're weaving, you're always going to be creating different patterns. You're always going to have these different networks as you're threading. And then the second example that I wanted to talk about is the actual weaving the velvet. You know, velvet takes such a long time to produce that I'm still in the first year and I've only just begun to weave. I've spent most of my time so far completely immersed in bobbins. But now I'm able to start weaving some velvet and also to be able to start using the bobbins in the way they were really intended. Replacing some of the velvet silk with conductive fibers such as stainless steel and silver allow me to create soft sensors out of the velvet. It means they can work as capacitive sensors, switches, touch sensors, pressure sensors. It allows them to respond to gentle human interaction. What this means is that the velvet can react and communicate. It can find ways to store the information that is embedded in it that we're identifying, and then feed it back to whoever is interacting with it. And the types of information that get embedded in a piece of velvet, what's in there? It's similar to the bobbins. You can read the topography of a piece of velvet. These are just a few examples. There's so much information in this one little square. You can see where I used the wrong shape cutting blade. I called this section with the loops the factory reset because the velvet was so fragile that I didn't want to cut the pile. I didn't want to create these really short ends. So you just allow yourself to reset and go back to zero. And there's this moment where I finally found the correct cutting blade, which I'm thrilled about. It's taken a while. And then you can see at the edges, I can see as I've started to adapt the selvage tension, which I need to be able to get the correct selvage or edge of the woven fabric. Normally with weaving, you don't want to pull too tight. You want to keep it quite loose. You don't want to hurt the warp threads at the end. In this instance, I've learned you want to overpull them. You want to pull them too tight because you have to secure those outer ends of velvet. All of these threads in velvet are getting cut and it's just pressure that's holding them together. And then you can see at the top of the velvet, a problem that I'm currently facing now, which is that the weights attached to each bobbin have been too heavy. That's what I've learned. And they don't allow me to wind the velvet forward as needed. So now I have to go back and I have to recalibrate and find the right weights. And you just go back and you repeat, you reiterate again and again until the velvet is showing you exactly what you need, until the velvet is demonstrating to you that you found the right balance. And this is where I am now, as I said. So I'm in the first year of this project, and I'm really excited with the place that I'm at the moment. And what comes next is similarly with the bobbins, with being able to translate that information into the bobbin bank. I now know that I have the ability to embed these conductive fibers into velvet and to create these responsive materials. So now the question is, how can this type of information be properly identified and then placed back into the velvet so that it can echo back the information that is already lying within it. So yes, so that is where it is. And thank you very much. I believe that's just about 20 minutes.